Welcome back, listeners, to another deep dive here in the Occult Archives. Today, we're going into some pretty deep waters.
That's right. We're cracking open a book that I guess you could say caused a bit of a stir when it first came out back in 1960.
Ernest L. Norman's Cosmic Continuum.
Yeah, and it's not exactly, a beach read.
Right.
Norman's really trying to bridge the gap between hard science and spirituality. He's trying to paint a picture of existence, I guess you could say.
A really big picture.
A huge picture. He pulls from, it seems like, from established scientific principles, philosophical ideas, and even his interpretations of religious figures to build his case.
So for our listeners who are interested in the really big questions, but don't want to get bogged down in the really technical stuff, our goal today is to unpack the most interesting and thought-provoking concepts from Cosmic Continuum.
Exactly. We'll be focusing specifically on Norman's ideas about life, energy, and the spiritual evolution of the soul.
So, right out of the gate, Norman tells us that the most fundamental aspect of reality, it's not the physical stuff we see and touch every day. It's energy.
And this is where it gets really interesting. He says that this energy is essentially spirit.
It's all connected in his view.
Right. He talks about energy existing in multiple dimensions.
Yeah.
What we think of as solid matter, the stuff we interact with, is just it's just one way that this energy can show itself.
Like, water can be ice, it can be liquid, or it can be steam.
Exactly.
All the same basic stuff, just, in different forms.
And what's really important here is that Norman emphasizes how active this energy is. If everything is energy at its core, and energy is always in motion, then everything that happens, every action, every event, it all starts in these invisible dimensions.
Dimensions beyond what we can see and touch.
Exactly.
And this isn't just some abstract concept. This energy, he says, it directly shapes our consciousness. It even influences the very atoms that make up our bodies.
That's right.
He connects this energy to our everyday consciousness. He describes it as a kind of a pattern that's formed by all of our experiences, especially our past life experiences. He uses the term sine wave energies to describe this.
So a sine wave, it's just a smooth, repeating wave pattern. He's using this idea to suggest that that our past experiences create these energy patterns that shape who we are right now.
Our history leaves an energetic mark on us, you could say.
He even calls these past life relationships the negative polarity of life.
Interesting. Now, when we face difficult situations, a lot of people turn to the idea of divine intercession, this idea that some higher power is going to step in and fix things for us.
Right, kind of a safety net when things get rough.
Yeah.
But Norman challenges this assumption.
Yeah. And he uses the example of Jesus, who for many is central to this idea of divine intercession.
According to Cosmic Continuum, Jesus didn't heal everyone who asked for his help.
Right. For every miracle, there were many more who continued to suffer.
It's a pretty bold statement.
It is.
Yeah.
And Norman suggests that healing and personal transformation, they're not, random acts of God. They're tied to our own understanding and ability to deal with these negative energy patterns within us.
Within what he calls the psychic body. It's kind of like a non-physical part of ourselves where these energetic imprints are held.
So it's about working with and harmonizing those sine wave energies from our past. Okay, so now Norman takes us to the fourth dimension, and before anyone gets any sci-fi ideas, Norman's concept of the fourth dimension, it's a realm where life is transmitted as a cyclic motion within these energy waveforms.
Basically, a continuous loop or circle.
Right, and it's this constant turning, the cyclical movement of energy that he thinks is key.
Yeah.
Now, this is something that even Einstein thought about, how energy moves from our three-dimensional world into these higher dimensions.
Like the fourth, the fifth dimension, and beyond.
Norman suggests that this cyclic motion, this constant movement in a circle, is a fundamental part of how energy is transferred.
It's like a spinning wheel that can move not just around, but also along its axis into another space.
That's a good analogy. And he even uses a scientific principle we might be familiar with to explain this, catalysis.
All right.
He explains that all atoms have a field of force around them because of the way their electrical charges are constantly moving, and this means they're always radiating energy waveforms.
And he uses a really simple example to illustrate this. Table salt.
Oh, okay.
You've got chlorine, which is a poisonous gas. And you've got sodium, which is a very reactive metal. Normally, they wouldn't combine on their own.
Right.
But through catalysis, which is basically nature's way of helping reactions along, often using things like sunlight, they're brought together. And under the right conditions, they share an electron and they form salt. Stable, harmless salt.
So it's like incompatible things coming together to make something totally new.
Exactly.
Right.
And Norman uses this to show how energy can transform in much more fundamental ways.
So, according to Norman, everything we do, every action, is basically a transmission of energy. Like the energy a musician uses to play a soft note, it's the same energy they could use to slam on the keys.
Right.
It's the intention behind the energy that makes the difference.
And this is where individual responsibility comes in. Norman stresses that every person gets to decide whether the energy they're putting out into the world is constructive or destructive. It all feeds back into their own spiritual evolution.
Our choices, our thoughts, our actions, they all have energetic consequences.
And what about those negative experiences we all carry with us? The bad memories, the mistakes.
He says those create negative energy waveforms that get stuck in our psychic body, and that leads to guilt. Like our past is echoing within us energetically.
But there is a more hopeful side to this.
Hmm.
Norman says that in the spiritual worlds, that place between our physical lives, we become more aware of what he calls the superconscious presence,
A kind of higher awareness.
right? Like a connection to universal intelligence. And in that state, there's a natural urge to resolve those negative energy patterns. He talks about learning and making connections in those spiritual realms.
Like a time for reflection and understanding before we come back to Earth.
Exactly. So bringing this all back to the idea of healing, Norman revisits the example of Jesus and the people he healed. He says it wasn't magic. It was a recombining of scientific principles.
He's saying that the people who were healed, they already understood how to fix those negative energy patterns from their time in the spiritual world.
And he describes how Jesus, as an avatar, helped them do this. He talks about frequency vibration and a connection with that life between lives. Like Jesus could tune in to the right frequencies to help them dissolve those negative patterns.
And he gets really out there with this idea of psychokinesis coming from Jesus's higher self. It's not just moving energy around. It's using mental force to instantly change the structure of the body at an atomic level.
A very different interpretation of miracles.
It is. So Norman then talks about this ancient struggle between, good and evil, this battle between positive and negative forces. He says it's a basic but kind of primitive process of trying to find balance.
Equilibrium.
Right. And he uses this image of a kid spinning a top to explain it. The energy from the kid's hand makes the top spin. But then, physics takes over, friction, inertia, all that. And the spinning energy starts to change into something else, like heat.
He's showing us this constant flow and transformation of energy.
And he ties this to our own spiritual development in what he calls the superconsciousness. He says we grow in that higher state of awareness based on how we interact with the energy around us.
Do we disrupt the patterns in a negative way, or do we try to align ourselves with more harmonious frequencies?
So this is where it gets kind of dark. Norman says that someone focused on negativity, someone we might call evil, can actually develop a really strong superconsciousness.
They can become, he says, a negative avatar. Powerful, but ultimately self-destructive.
Their power is built on something that's fundamentally unstable.
And he says there's a difference between people who are just naturally negative and people who are once spiritually developed but have fallen back. Those people have a much harder path ahead of them.
They have to make up for all the harm they've caused.
It's like the idea of purgatory, which Norman says is basically a self-imposed state we experience as a result of our negative actions.
And he warns that anyone who develops a strong superconsciousness faces a constant temptation to misuse that power for their own benefit. It's a dangerous path that leads to destruction. He even uses the story of Jesus being tempted in the desert as an example of this struggle.
Which brings us to a really important point. Norman says we have to reject these false ideas we have, like divine intercession, as a way to avoid responsibility, or the idea that we can be saved by some external master.
He calls that the greatest of all hypocrisies.
He says that the infinite creative force, what many would call God, is constantly renewing itself in infinite forms and energy patterns. True spiritual growth comes from connecting with that infinite source directly, not relying on external figures or rules.
And it's interesting, he compares scientists and religious devotees. He says both can fall into a kind of idolatry. The scientist might worship the atom or mathematical formulas, while the religious person might get fixated on an external image of God.
And he contrasts this with Jesus' teachings, which always pointed back to that inner connection with the infinite.
It's about cultivating that relationship within yourself, not just through rituals or beliefs. Now, Norman points out a really strange paradox. We live in an infinite universe filled with abundance, and yet so many of us are caught up in this mad scramble for survival.
Driven by insecurity and fear.
He traces this back to our basic survival instincts. He says that even in our modern world, we're still operating on a pretty basic level of consciousness.
He also takes a pretty critical look at the entertainment industry. He's particularly concerned with the focus on sex and violence. He argues that these negative images can have a bad influence on us because of what he calls frequency relationships.
Like attracts like on an energetic level.
Exactly. Negative input can create more negativity within us.
Now, for the average person, the person who's not a saint but not a villain either, Norman says they'll probably evolve constructively over time as long as they don't let negativity take over. It's a long, slow process for most of us.
But he warns that even those who are seeking spiritual understanding will always face temptation.
Mm.
He uses the example of Jesus struggling with temptation for years as a way to show this ongoing internal battle.
So he tells the listener directly that the difficult things we face in life, the financial struggles, the health problems, the emotional pain, those are all results of our own creation over many lifetimes.
They come from holding on to false ideas.
But he also says that we have the power to overcome these challenges. It comes from within us, from our spiritual wisdom and that superconsciousness. He says that the saving master we're looking for is actually the sum of all the good we've learned within ourselves.
Now, Norman talks about this thing that happens to people who are going through a spiritual awakening. They suddenly feel this urge to change the world, to help those who are suffering. He says that this is a natural response, but it can also be a way to avoid dealing with our own guilt and inner conflicts.
An escape mechanism.
Exactly. And he warns that people driven by this can become fanatical, joining cults, or following strange religious practices.
He even suggests that religious fanatics can attract negative spiritual entities that can influence their followers.
He's critical of some faith healing movements, too. He says they often create a temporary connection with higher psychic centers, but it's not true healing.
It's more about the healer's ego than actually helping people. And he links these expensive healing practices to a desire for power over others. He even uses the term vampirism of souls.
Strong words.
They are. Now, he turns his attention to science and medicine, pointing out that real understanding often comes very slowly. He gives examples of scientific theories that were accepted for centuries, but turned out to be wrong.
Like Galen's ideas about the human body.
Right. And he argues that modern medicine and psychology make a big mistake by focusing only on the physical body and trying to understand the infinite based on what they can see and measure.
He even says that our instincts are actually energetic imprints from our past lives.
He brings up Jesus' teaching to seek ye the kingdom of heaven, which is within. Norman says this is the key to freeing ourselves from rigid belief systems. Our true nature, our potential, it's all within our own consciousness.
And our consciousness is connected to these spiritual realms.
He comes back to the idea of false prophets, saying that we're responsible for the false gods and the harmful systems we follow. He compares these efforts towards peace to the constant reality of war and hatred, suggesting that this conflict is actually a necessary part of our evolution.
Like a refining metal in a furnace.
So he clarifies what he means by superconsciousness. It's not just a higher level of ordinary consciousness. It's positively oriented parts of the infinite mind, each with its own creative purpose.
He says these parts form spiritual cell structures that resonate with the positive qualities we've developed over our many lifetimes.
And these structures guide us towards higher states of awareness. He even says that this interaction with our higher self is our life force, our vital energy.
Our libido, some might say.
Right. And here's an important point. He says that every single person is equally important to infinite consciousness. Each of us reflects a part of infinity. He even suggests that this whole idea of a battle between good and evil is a very basic and inaccurate understanding of how cosmic forces work.
So he talks about time and space, saying they're basically the same thing. They represent the movement of consciousness between different levels of existence. And all the intelligence in the infinite consciousness exists as space in terms of its unique frequency.
And everything, even atoms, are constantly being renewed. He says that each of us is always presenting our unique consciousness to the infinite, evolving through our experiences.
So we can develop our superconsciousness by aligning ourselves with those spiritual cell structures that resonate with the infinite. This, combined with the lessons we learn from our Earth lives, allows our superconsciousness to become stronger.
And that can lead to what seem like miraculous things happening in our lives.
But he reminds us that our everyday consciousness is just a small part of the picture. We can't limit our understanding to what we see on the surface.
He criticizes those who judge consciousness based only on what they can observe. He says they're trying to judge the infinite, which is impossible.
He also points out that a lot of our religious practices, like Christmas and Easter, are actually adapted from older pagan traditions.
And he says that many people who call themselves religious don't actually live by the principles of their religion. They're still stuck in old judgmental ways of thinking.
He sees these practices as ways to avoid taking responsibility for our actions.
Now, he even criticizes Freudian psychology. He sees it as a step back towards the idea that our minds are blank slates at birth. He says Freud ignores the importance of instincts, except for the sex drive, and doesn't connect us to our past or future.
He even suggests that Freud's theories might have come from a casual observation and were just a way for him to justify his own lack of understanding.
He argues that instinct is the wrong word. Intelligence is more accurate. He uses examples like spiders building webs and ducklings swimming to show this innate intelligence that comes from previous lifetimes.
He says the complexity of life reflects the accumulated intelligence from past lives.
He describes atoms as helpers in the expression of energy waveforms that come from a psychic cell in another dimension.
And he says that newborns and all living things instantly draw on this information from past lives to adapt to their new environment.
He emphasizes that the basic principles of life are the same across all levels of existence.
He suggests that even atoms have their own consciousness and express themselves in a continuous way.
Norman criticizes the dogmatic attitudes of some psychologists and doctors. He says they've dismissed the soul and misinterpreted things like the Oedipus complex, attributing it to unresolved issues from past lives.
He points out how much medical science still doesn't know about the real causes of diseases, suggesting that many illnesses originate in past lives.
He envisions a future where we achieve a kind of utopia through evolution. Asylums, prisons, and hospitals will be replaced by learning centers that focus on healing us on a spiritual level before problems manifest physically.
We'll move from just fixing broken bodies to preventing and resolving psychic shocks.
But he warns against trying to control other people. He says each person has their own connection to the infinite will, and interfering with that has consequences.
He also warns that focusing too much on current medical and psychological practices can lead us astray from our true evolutionary path.
He reminds us that people who bring new knowledge are often persecuted for challenging existing beliefs.
Like Jesus and many others throughout history.
Norman defines sin as the misuse of the basic elements of life, not as something that's part of the infinite mind. He says that our past mistakes become the core of our guilt, and we learn about infinity by experiencing both good and evil.
Which sets the stage for future evolution.
He points out the limitations of current science. Even Newton's laws have their limits. He talks about breaking the sound barrier and the challenges we face in space travel, like the thermal barrier.
He says that our three-dimensional world is kind of like a parasite. The physical laws we see are just reflections of energy from higher dimensions.
He says that empty space is actually infinitely dense and filled with energy. The Earth, the sun, and all the stars are points where energy from other dimensions is transferred.
He even challenges the idea that light travels through space, suggesting that it's an instantaneous transfer of energy because everything is connected.
He says that consciousness can appear anywhere in the universe through these energy transfers. He uses Jesus's miracles as examples of this kind of frequency transference.
And he emphasizes that if we truly understand concepts, the barriers of time and space disappear. Our physical bodies don't limit the reach of consciousness.
He explains that humans are still relatively primitive in terms of consciousness, which is why we're so ignorant. We need to free our minds from the limitations of our physical senses and the way science tries to define the infinite.
He believes that humans can evolve to a point where we integrate more fully with the infinite and transcend our animalistic nature.
He offers a new perspective on cosmic rays and the formation of stars and planets. He says that what we see as particle masses are actually created by energy transfers from dimensions beyond our scientific understanding. He uses the analogy of waves on a pond to show how energy can be transferred without any physical movement.
He explains that energy renews itself in cycles, like waves, showing intelligence and interconnectedness. He talks about adhesion and repulsion as being like the attraction and repulsion between atomic fields.
He summarizes a key point. Nothing in the infinite is static. Everything is in constant motion, oscillating between positive and negative polarities, these energy waveforms.
He predicts that future scientists will study consciousness in higher dimensions, leading to breakthroughs beyond what we can imagine now. They might even learn how to manipulate atomic vibrations to overcome gravity and electromagnetism, making things like flying saucers possible.
He says that he's not the originator of these ideas, just a channel for them. His own elevated consciousness gives him a perspective that sees the world as trapped in ignorance.
He echoes Jesus' frustration with materialism, calling humans hypocrites for betraying their connection to the infinite creative force.
He criticizes the motivation behind atomic research, saying it's mostly driven by the desire for weapons, not true understanding.
Norman challenges the idea of a molten iron core at the center of the Earth. He says the Earth's interior is made up of layers of energy that become increasingly intense towards the center. The Earth's crust is just a layer of ballast atomic energy.
He even suggests that the Earth's core is a kind of vacuum that we don't understand.
He describes how the Earth would look from space, with a corona of energy surrounding it, making the surface hard to see, like Venus and the Sun.
He says that the sun's chromosphere is actually a supercharged energy field around a denser planet, and sunspots are just temporary openings in that field.
He argues that the Sun isn't hot in the way we think of it. It's more like a giant electromagnetic field that transforms energy into heat and light, which then interacts with Earth's own electromagnetic field.
He predicts that future space travelers will discover that the sun isn't actually that hot and can be passed through.
He says the Sun is just a planet within a larger galactic structure.
He explains that over many lifetimes, we develop reactive patterns in our consciousness that make us sensitive to certain types of energy, like heat.
He contrasts the human reason with the more direct energy transference seen in other species.
He defines reason as the formation of connections between our physical and spiritual dimensions. And he suggests that in the future, we might evolve beyond the need for physical bodies, which would eliminate the fear of death.
He reiterates his idea that the Earth's interior is made up of layers of energy, not molten rock.
He emphasizes that our current scientific tools, which rely on our five senses, give us a very limited view of reality, especially when we try to study things outside of Earth's atmosphere.
He explains superconductivity as a state where atoms are temporarily isolated from their usual energy activity, making them perfectly conductive.
He reaffirms his idea that space is infinitely filled with energy, a highly organized system that transfers energy between dimensions through harmonic structures.
Norman dismisses the idea that planets and stars form from dust clouds, calling it infantile. He says that celestial bodies are points where energy from other dimensions is focused.
He argues that energy, heat, and light don't actually come from the sun. They're transformations of energy within our own dimension.
He suggests that precipitation happens because of ionization in the atmosphere, which is influenced by forces from outside of Earth. High and low pressure systems are areas where magnetic energy is compressed or released, which affects conductivity and rainfall.
He warns that relying too much on scientific instruments that measure only physical things will limit our understanding of the infinite.
He encourages us to embrace our true nature as intelligent beings made up of interdimensional consciousness. Our journey of growth and discovery is endless.
He concludes that in this interplay of consciousness, we become part of the infinite.
He acknowledges the work of scientists, but points out that true understanding comes slowly. He talks about how some scientific knowledge, like the Earth's circumference, was known long ago but was suppressed.
He presents the current scientific understanding of the universe's vastness.
He introduces the vortex theory of cosmic structure, where suns and planets are the centers of giant energy vortexes.
He believes that future science will eventually confirm the ideas presented in Cosmic Continuum.
He talks about the rapid advancements in science and technology since the late 1800s, which have led us to the space age.
He highlights the fact that our understanding of the universe is constantly changing.
He mentions a discussion between astronomers who agreed on the basic makeup of stars, but disagreed about how the universe began and how old it is.
He explains the steady-state theory and then offers a more detailed explanation based on a massive energy vortex in higher dimensions.
Positive energy flows outward, while negative energy compresses at the center. This creates magnetic lines of force, electrons, protons, and eventually galaxies, stars, and planets.
He explains things like novae and pulsating stars as being caused by rapid changes in energy within this vortex. The rotation of the universe and the vortex itself explains why galaxies move at different speeds.
Galaxies form from swirling currents within the vortex, and stars and atoms form from forces coming from the fourth dimension. Cosmic rays are just basic energy units ejected into space, and the network of magnetic lines of force controls the orbits of planets and the shapes of galaxies.
He says that the more science relies on its current assumptions, the more confused it becomes.
He hopes that future scientists will develop a more accurate understanding of the universe based on the idea that creation comes from higher dimensions.
He suggests that the expansion of the universe will eventually reach a point where everything collapses back into energy.
This explains things like the curvature of space and radioactive decay.
He briefly mentions Norman's later life, including his clairvoyant abilities and his mission to spread spiritual and scientific knowledge.
This was a time of great psychic activity and marked the beginning of a new era.
Well, that was a deep dive into cosmic continuum. We've explored some pretty complex ideas about energy, consciousness, and the interconnectedness of everything.
These are concepts that can really challenge our understanding of reality.
So here's something to think about. If our physical world is just a manifestation of energy from other dimensions, what other unseen forces might be shaping our lives?
It's a question worth pondering.
We encourage you to continue exploring these ideas on your own. Maybe revisit some of the things we've talked about, or even check out Cosmic Continuum yourself. Until next time.
Keep searching.